There are moments in a person's life when the world rearranges itself quietly, without thunder, without warning, just a soft shift beneath your feet, so subtle you almost miss it. Looking back now, I realize the first shift happened the moment that invitation arrived. Not a dramatic moment, not a cinematic revelation, but the kind of moment that enters the room softly, sits down across from you, and waits for you to notice that everything has already begun to change. I remember the email clearly. Clean, formal, confident. A major international technology conference. One of those events where the name alone turns heads, where the guest list reads like the index of a billionaire's contact book. I've been invited to countless events like that, of course. When you spend long enough building companies, shaking hands with presidents and prime ministers, navigating the global maze of commerce and innovation, these invitations become routine. They arrive the way sunlight arrives, expected, unremarkable, constant. And yet, this one felt different. Not because the event itself stood out, but because of the tone behind it, a certain firmness in the language, a certain precision in how they addressed me. It was the tone of an institution that does not ask, it summons. Still, I accepted. Why wouldn't I? A conference of this scale is always a useful place to re-anchor your perspective, to meet people shaping the world, to hear what the next decade might sound like, to sense where the currents of innovation are flowing. It felt like a standard professional opportunity, the kind of thing I could walk into blindfolded and navigate without effort. And so I prepared a standard talk. Clean, elegant, entirely technical. Nothing political, nothing sharp, nothing that could be misread by anyone, anywhere. At least, that's what I thought. The days leading up to the trip unfolded with an almost ceremonial calm. My assistants arranged flights, my team ensured logistics were smooth, and everything flowed with the sort of quiet efficiency I've grown accustomed to, a privilege of success that few mention, but all enjoy. When you've built empires, the world learns to move out of your way. But beneath that calm, something else hummed, something I didn't yet understand. The plane touched down 2 days before my keynote. The air that greeted me was crisp, filtered through a silence that felt engineered. Everything at the airport worked with a mechanical grace. Impressive, yes, but almost too impressive, too deliberate. It felt as though every motion around me had been choreographed by someone backstage. Immigration officers approached me with a politeness that felt heavy, a politeness so sharp it cut. They asked more questions than necessary, paused longer than normal, studied my passport as if it contained a secret message only they had been trained to decode. But I brushed it off. These things happen. High-profile individuals often attract scrutiny. It was easy, too easy, to explain away. Yet, as I walked through the airport, I could not shake the faint sensation that I was being observed. Not watched like a threat, observed like an equation, analyzed, interpreted, measured. At the hotel, that sensation only deepened. The staff were immaculate, precise, efficient, polite, but their politeness wasn't the warm, professional kind I usually see. This was different. This was controlled politeness, scripted politeness, the kind of politeness that carries instructions printed silently behind the eyes. When they greeted me, their smiles didn't reach the places where real smiles live. Their posture held a stiffness that suggested awareness, not comfort. Everything felt pre-approved. Still, I told myself, you're overthinking this. You're tired. This is a big country with big security protocols. Relax. But the human mind has a way of recognizing quiet danger long before the conscious mind accepts it. And mine was whispering, not loudly, but insistently, that something in the atmosphere was wrong. The first evening passed without incident. I met a few entrepreneurs, bright minds, ambitious, forward-thinking. We spoke about AI, renewable energy, automation, all the usual topics. Their enthusiasm was genuine, their insights impressive. It was easy to forget the heaviness that lingered at the edges of every interaction. But even then, there were signs. When conversations drifted into areas even remotely connected to politics, global markets, government regulations, international competition, the tone shifted. Smiles tightened, eyes flicked around the room. Some people straightened their posture, as if suddenly aware of invisible microphones. It was subtle, yes, but it was unmistakable. People were cautious here, careful in ways that didn't feel natural. At the time, I didn't know how deep that caution ran. I didn't know the architecture of silence that shaped their lives. I didn't know the cost of a misplaced word. Not yet, but I would learn, and I would learn painfully. For now, though, I simply moved through the evening with the quiet ease of a man accustomed to foreign atmospheres, accustomed to adapting, observing, adjusting without drawing attention. Still, the feeling lingered. That same quiet hum. The sense that my presence was being noted, cataloged, followed by unseen eyes that didn't blink. By the second day, I began to test the atmosphere, gently, casually. I would make harmless observations and watch how the air shifted around them. And every time I said something that could, if someone truly stretched, be interpreted politically, I felt the room tighten. Not everyone, not obviously, but the careful ones, the aware ones, the ones who had grown up learning never to say more than necessary. That's when the realization began to dawn on me. Not with panic, not with drama, but with a slow, heavy clarity. I was not in a place where speaking was simple. I was in a place where speaking was a calculation. And I had walked into this place with the casual confidence of someone who had never needed to calculate a sentence in his life. I didn't know it yet, but that confidence would cost me. And it would cost me more than I ever expected. When the second morning arrived, I found myself observing the city with a quieter kind of awareness, the kind that settles into a person only after they've spent enough time somewhere to sense the currents beneath the surface. From my hotel room window, I watched people move through the streets with an almost rehearsed rhythm, orderly, efficient, purposeful, but always with a subtle tension in their posture, as if every decision carried a weight that wasn't fully visible. I couldn't yet name what I was feeling, but I recognized the sensation. The atmosphere of a place where people measure their words before they speak and calculate their steps before they move. It was a kind of discipline that doesn't come naturally. It's learned, practiced, reinforced. At breakfast, the hotel staff greeted me with polished smiles, the kind that were flawless but not warm, as if they were fulfilling a requirement rather than participating in a human exchange. They were respectful, precise, attentive, almost overly so. Every gesture seemed rehearsed, measured, rehearsed again. And although nothing was wrong, something was undeniably missing. The ease that usually exists in places where people are free to simply be themselves. The hotel felt like a stage, and everyone in it acted like they were performing a role they couldn't step out of. Later that afternoon, I attended several conference sessions. The presentations were sharp, polished, and technically impressive, but the conversations happening afterward revealed something deeper. When speakers discussed AI models, energy infrastructure, quantum computing, everyone leaned forward, engaged, alive. But the moment a topic drifted even slightly toward governance, regulation, ethics, or societal impact, the energy shifted. People stiffened, eyes drifted around the room, and the conversation would quietly dissolve, as if someone had turned down the volume on the entire space. It wasn't discomfort, it was fear, faint but unmistakable. During a coffee break, I stood with 3 engineers, all brilliant, all enthusiastic about their work. For a few minutes, the conversation flowed easily. We talked about battery technologies and supply chain optimization. But when one of them mentioned that innovation also depends on environmental conditions, the others glanced around so quickly that even he noticed and immediately stopped speaking. There was a silence, the kind that feels like a cold draft passing through a room. Then, without acknowledging the moment, they shifted to a completely different subject. Smoothly, automatically, like people who had done this more times than they could count. By evening, the pattern was undeniable. People weren't just avoiding sensitive topics. They were afraid of proximity to them. Afraid of being associated with the wrong sentence at the wrong moment. Afraid of saying something that could be interpreted incorrectly, even if their intentions were harmless. It was a kind of collective self-preservation. And the more I noticed it, the heavier it felt. That night, over dinner with several local entrepreneurs, the feeling intensified. These were young, ambitious founders, the kind who should have been overflowing with ideas, raw honesty, and bold visions. For the first 20 minutes, they were exactly that. Their energy was infectious, their enthusiasm real. They talked about robotics, expansion plans, cross-border systems, everything with genuine excitement. But when I casually mentioned that technology should grow in ways that empower people, a simple, universal statement I've said 1,000 times in 100 countries, The atmosphere shifted instantly. One sentence, something so benign it wouldn't even register in most places, abruptly drained the table of its warmth. Their voices dropped. Their posture changed. They exchanged quick, fearful glances. And someone, almost immediately, redirected the conversation into something safe, something neutral, something meaningless. In less than 5 minutes, nearly all of them excused themselves, their faces polite but uneasy, and I was left sitting there alone with a quiet I didn't intend to create. The moment lingered with me long after the plates were cleared. It wasn't anger I felt, it was sadness, because I couldn't shake the awareness that these brilliant minds had learned to fear their own thoughts. Not because they were saying anything dangerous, but because they had been conditioned to anticipate danger even where none was intended. The freedom to explore ideas, the very essence of innovation, had been replaced with a constant internal audit. Every sentence was a calculation, every conversation a risk assessment. Later that night, as I walked back to my room, the entire city felt different. Not darker, not threatening, just controlled, predictable, supervised. It was a place where the walls felt like they were listening, where silence seemed safer than honesty, and where people had learned that safety depends on saying less than what's true. And that realization settled heavily on me, because I knew I would have to stand on a stage the next morning and give a speech in the center of all of this. A speech that, for better or worse, would determine more than just how people perceived me. It would determine how welcome I was in a country that valued silence more than truth. In the quiet hours that followed that strange dinner, I found myself alone in my hotel room, sitting beside a window that overlooked a city glowing with lights, yet carrying an unmistakable heaviness in the air. It was a strange contrast, beauty wrapped in silence, progress wrapped in caution. The kind of silence you don't hear, but you feel. And as I sat there, trying to replay the conversations of the past 2 days, one truth slowly settled into place. People were not simply careful, they were conditioned. Conditioned to measure every word, to calculate every sentence, to read the room before daring to speak. I realized that every interaction I had witnessed, every smile, every nod, every harmless sentence, was wrapped in an invisible layer of self-protection. It felt less like a conference and more like a stage, a place where everyone had learned exactly how to perform, exactly what to avoid, exactly how to survive. And that realization brought with it a strange, heavy clarity I couldn't shake. I kept thinking about the young entrepreneurs I had met the night before. Bright minds, brilliant potential, eyes full of ideas they were too afraid to voice. They reminded me of a future with the brakes pulled tight, of a generation trained to innovate only within invisible boundaries. It bothered me deeply, not because they lacked talent, but because they weren't allowed to express it freely. A place full of innovation, yet quietly lacking the one ingredient that turns ideas into revolutions: the freedom to explore them without fear. I sat with that thought for a long time, feeling it settle into my chest like a stone. It made me think about my own life, my own country, the privilege of speaking without looking over my shoulder. I had taken that freedom for granted. Here, in this room, in this country, I could feel the absence of it like a physical presence. And for the first time since I arrived, I understood why my words, any words, mattered more here than they should have. That night, I paced the room in a way I haven't done in years, thinking about the speech I was supposed to give the next morning. The safe option sat neatly on my desk, a perfect, polished, harmless keynote about innovation. It would have earned applause, photographs, polite smiles, and a smooth exit. But I couldn't ignore what I had seen, what I had felt. The way people straightened their backs when certain topics arose, the way conversations dissolved at the slightest hint of truth. I couldn't shake the image of those young founders lowering their voices, scanning the room, suddenly remembering they had somewhere else to be. Innovation could not grow in soil that afraid of sunlight. And I knew that if I stepped on that stage pretending everything was normal, I would be participating in the very silence that suffocates progress. Even a man of wealth, power, and influence, someone like me, could feel the walls closing in, the subtle pressure to behave, to comply, to say nothing real. And if I felt that pressure, even for a weekend, then the people who lived here felt it every day of their lives. The realization was unsettling, infuriating, and strangely clarifying all at once. So I made a decision. Not heroic, not rebellious, simply honest. I picked up my notes, took a pen, and rewrote the heart of my speech. Not an attack, not an accusation, not even a challenge. Just one small observation. Calm, measured, truthful. A sentence about freedom. A sentence about the atmosphere I had felt since the moment I arrived. A sentence I knew would land like a stone dropped into still water. As I wrote it, I felt neither fear nor pride, just a quiet certainty. A wealthy man can afford many luxuries, but the rarest among them is the ability to speak honestly in a place where honesty is treated as danger. I knew the consequences could be real, but so was the truth. And that night, under the dim hotel lights, I accepted that some truths, even spoken softly, create storms simply because they were never meant to be spoken at all. There comes a moment in every journey where the world around you seems perfectly still, almost suspended in a kind of quiet that feels unnatural, as if someone has pressed their hand gently against the atmosphere and told it not to breathe. That was the feeling that settled over me the night before my keynote. The strange, heavy awareness that I was no longer just a speaker preparing for a conference, but a man walking a very thin line in a place where speech itself was measured, weighed, and judged according to rules no one dared explain aloud. I sat in my hotel room, the kind built to impress foreign guests, with polished marble, silent hallways, and the subtle coldness of luxury that carries no warmth. The city lights outside flickered across the glass, but even the skyline felt restrained, as if everything in this place obeyed an invisible boundary. I kept thinking about the conversations I'd had over the past 2 days, how a simple remark had made people fall silent and shift their eyes, how so many brilliant minds seemed to move with caution, like dancers taught to make sure every footstep landed in a safe zone. And so I rewrote my speech, not in anger, not in defiance, but out of something much quieter and more honest. The belief that truth, spoken softly, is still truth. I didn't intend to confront anyone. I didn't intend to provoke. I intended only to acknowledge what everyone felt but no one could say, to speak a single paragraph that carried the weight of a reality people lived with every day. When morning came, I walked onto that stage with the calmness of a man who knows he's already made his choice. The lights were warm, the audience attentive, the whole room wrapped in a professional elegance designed to project modernity and progress. And as I delivered the opening of my talk, the safe parts, the technical pieces, the expected insights, I could feel the atmosphere relax around me. Everything was going exactly the way it was supposed to, until I reached that one added section, the one truth that refused to remain unspoken. As my voice moved through that paragraph about freedom, hesitation, and the quiet fear I had seen in the conversations of the people here, the air in the room changed. It tightened. It sharpened. It listened. Not the attentive listening of curiosity, but the rigid listening of surveillance. The kind that turns an ordinary sentence into an evaluated risk. I could feel eyes narrowing, shoulders straightening, breaths halting. Yet I kept going, not louder, not braver, just steady, calm, measured, because there is a certain kind of courage that doesn't roar. It simply refuses to vanish. When the talk ended, applause rose politely but without warmth, like the sound of formality rather than appreciation. I stepped off the stage already sensing that my quiet truth had struck deeper than I intended. And in that hour, before officials approached me, before the discussions turned formal, before the consequences began to take shape, I felt a kind of stillness settle in my chest. Not fear, not regret, just the realization that sometimes the price of honesty is paid immediately, quietly, and without negotiation. There is a certain stillness that settles over a person when they finally understand the cost of honesty. It's not dramatic, not loud, not even emotional in the way people imagine. It's quieter, almost dignified. The same kind of quiet you hear in a boardroom after a deal collapses. Not because anyone shouted, but because someone spoke a truth the room wasn't ready for. That was the quiet that followed me out of that country, a silence that felt like a velvet curtain falling behind me, heavy and final. And as I sat on the plane, waiting for takeoff, escorted like some fragile diplomatic package, I realized how strange it felt to have my fate decided not by crime, not by violence, not by some political speech, but by an observation that, in most of the world, would be considered polite and obvious. Innovation requires freedom. In my world, that sentence is as simple as saying steel needs strength or engines need fuel. And yet, in that moment, it was the most expensive sentence I had ever spoken. When we lifted off the runway, the city beneath me glowing with artificial brilliance, I stared out the window and felt an unexpected mixture of regret and relief. Regret because I knew the consequences, business complications, strained partnerships, doors closing that once were wide open. But relief because I had said what I believed, because wealth protects many things, but it doesn't protect a man from the burden of his own silence. I have seen powerful men become prisoners of their comfort, unable to speak even when their conscience begs them to. I have seen billionaires bend their principles to maintain access, influence, opportunity. And I have always wondered what their wealth was worth if it cost them their honesty. That night, flying out under the authority of a band stamped against my name, I felt lighter than I expected, because I hadn't paid that price. I hadn't traded truth for convenience. By the time I landed back in the United States, the story had already begun to spread: speculation, analysis, outrage, curiosity. People wanted to know what I had said, what line I had crossed, what offense I had committed. Some assumed I had attacked the government. Others thought I had revealed secrets, challenged policies, exposed hidden truths. But no, nothing dramatic. Just a simple observation woven into a 40-minute keynote, spoken calmly, carefully, without any intention of stirring controversy. That was the part the world couldn't quite believe, that such a small sentence could trigger such a large reaction. But that's the thing about tightly controlled systems. They are not threatened by attacks. They are threatened by observations. Attacks can be dismissed as hostility. Observations are harder to ignore. They reveal cracks in the walls. They call attention to the silence inside the room. When I walked through the airport back home, no one questioned me. No officials approached. No one pulled me aside to ask what I meant, what I implied, whom I offended. I walked through freely, passport unstamped by fear, and it felt extraordinary in a way I had never appreciated before. Freedom is like oxygen, ignored when it's abundant, noticed only when it's scarce. And after experiencing scarcity, even briefly, even as a foreign visitor, stepping back into abundance felt overwhelming. I could talk. I could explain. I could criticize. I could share the entire story publicly. There would be no agents waiting, no follow-up threats, no warnings to be careful. I had my voice back simply because I had crossed a border. Imagine that speech that is dangerous in one place becomes harmless 3,000 miles away. Over the following days, as the ban became public, journalists called, analysts speculated, commentators debated. Some sympathized, some mocked, some tried to turn the incident into a geopolitical headline. I stayed quiet for a while, not out of fear, but out of reflection. I wanted to understand why that one sentence had mattered so much. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that systems built on control are not actually afraid of rebellion. They are afraid of imagination. Because imagination leads to questions, and questions lead to alternatives, and alternatives lead to freedom. Innovation is simply imagination applied. So when you say innovation requires freedom, what they hear is something much larger. They hear a suggestion that imagination should not be contained. They hear an implication that control suffocates potential. They hear, beneath the polite phrasing, a challenge to the fundamental architecture of their system. I saw it clearly only after I left. The way people watched their own words, how they carried fear like a second language. They didn't need threats. The atmosphere did the work for them. The surveillance wasn't just cameras. It was the way people shaped their sentences. The way their eyes flicked around a room before they spoke. The way conversations shifted the moment they brushed against sensitive concepts. That is the kind of control that is impossible to measure but unmistakable to feel. And that was what I had pointed to on stage. Not a government, not a leader, not a policy, but a feeling. A feeling that millions of people carry every day, stitched so tightly into their lives that they almost forget it's there. But I noticed it. I spoke it aloud. And that, more than anything, was the true offense. We imagine bans as punishments, but they are also admissions. Admissions that a sentence reached deeper than intended, that it struck a nerve, that it named something that wasn't supposed to be spoken. And so when people asked me if I regretted the result, if I wished I had stayed quiet, if I would take it back given the business complications, the financial impact, The political tension? I answered simply, no. Because the truth is, wealth can replace almost anything: comfort, convenience, connections. But it cannot replace integrity once you give it up. A person who has everything but cannot speak honestly has nothing. And a person who loses access but keeps their truth has already won something far more valuable than permission to enter a country. There is a moment in every journey when the curve rises, not suddenly, not violently, but with a steady, deliberate incline. That was the shape of my thoughts as I sat in that hotel room after the speech, watching the city lights drift across the glass like silent warnings. I wasn't panicked. I wasn't afraid. I was simply aware. Aware that the atmosphere around me had shifted, that the conference organizers were moving differently, that the air itself felt heavier, as if the room carried a weight that didn't belong to me but had now been placed upon my shoulders. It was a strange kind of pressure, polite, quiet, wrapped in courtesy, yet undeniably firm in its intent. And as a man accustomed to boardrooms, negotiations, and high-stakes environments, I recognized that pressure instantly. It was the kind of pressure used by people who wanted you to understand without being told, who preferred unspoken warnings to open confrontation. The emails stopped coming. The hospitality softened. The invitations vanished. Conversations felt rehearsed. Even the hallways felt narrower, like they were guiding me toward an outcome I hadn't chosen. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't chaotic. It was controlled, contained, and perfectly managed. And that, in many ways, made it more unsettling. Wealth teaches you to recognize precision, how it looks, how it moves, how it organizes itself. And this was precision at work. Every gesture, every glance, every delayed response carried a quiet message. You said something you were not meant to say. And as much as I had expected some resistance, I hadn't expected silence to be the loudest response of all. When I finally returned to my room that night, I didn't pace. I didn't rehearse explanations. I simply sat, hands folded, watching the city that had suddenly become aware of me in a way I never intended. There was a kind of beauty in that moment, a calm before an outcome I could not yet define. It felt like standing in the middle of a long and elegant graph, right at the point where the line stops rising and begins its subtle downward slope, signaling that the next phase was beginning. I understood then that whatever happened next would not be a conversation, not a negotiation, not a discussion. It would be a decision, final, polished, and delivered with the same elegance as everything else in this place. The next morning confirmed my suspicions. People avoided eye contact. The staff who had previously greeted me with warm professionalism now moved with a reserved caution, like someone had drawn invisible lines between us. Even the air felt curated, still, controlled, expectant. And yet, through all of this, I maintained the calm that comes from experience, from wealth, from living long enough to understand that not every storm announces itself with thunder. Some arrive dressed in quiet suits, carrying documents instead of lightning. This was one of those storms. When the conference officials approached me later that day, their faces told the story before their words did. There was no anger, no accusation, only polished phrases, polished faces, polished consequences. They spoke of concerns, of misunderstandings, of inappropriate implications. They used the kind of language people use when they are delivering a verdict, but wanted to sound like a suggestion. And I listened, not because I expected fairness, but because listening was the only part of the process still within my control. The line on the graph was descending now, slowly, elegantly, predictably, but descending nonetheless. And I knew that once it reached the bottom, the decision would be sealed. What they didn't understand was that I had already accepted it. Not willingly, not eagerly, but truthfully. Because when you speak honestly in a place built on silence, the outcome is predetermined long before the words leave your mouth. I wasn't angry. I wasn't surprised. I simply understood. And in that understanding, there was a strange sense of peace, a calm that only comes when a man knows he would make the same choice again, even if it led him to the same consequences. There are moments in life when the world forces you to stand still, not because you want to, but because reality insists on being acknowledged. When I boarded the flight that day, escorted, watched, silently dismissed by a system that feared even the mildest truth, I felt something unusual settle inside me. It wasn't anger, not even disappointment. It was a kind of clarity, sharp, and unmistakable. When you see a place that polices words, you suddenly understand the value of your own voice in a way you never have before. It becomes obvious that freedom is not just a concept to debate or a principle to admire from a distance. It is a living, breathing condition that shapes the mind, the future, and the very possibility of progress. And when I landed back home, I realized I had carried that clarity with me like a quiet weight. I stepped off the plane, walked into the open air of my own country, and it felt like stepping out of a tightly sealed room. The difference wasn't in temperature or noise. The difference was in breath, in the invisible space around every sentence I could speak freely without fear. In the days that followed, the story spread quickly. Headlines questioned motives. Critics speculated. Analysts debated whether my words were unnecessary or brave. But none of that mattered to me. What mattered was the simple truth behind it all. Sometimes the smallest sentence reveals the largest system. And sometimes the reaction to that sentence tells you more than the sentence itself ever could. I kept thinking about the people I had met, the entrepreneurs, the hotel staff, the organizers, the quiet observers positioned just close enough to listen. I thought about how brilliant they were, how capable, how much potential existed in every conversation that almost happened but didn't, because someone in the room feared being overheard. And it struck me, profoundly, that brilliance living under caution is brilliance only half alive. Innovation cannot grow in a room where ideas must whisper. Progress cannot bloom where the mind must constantly shrink itself to fit inside the limits of acceptable thought. And as I reflected on it, I realized that my ban wasn't just a reaction to a speech. It was a confirmation of the very point I made. The more I spoke publicly about what happened, the more people reached out with their own experiences, some from countries I've never visited, some from places where free expression is a luxury, not a right. They told me stories of self-censorship, of unspoken ideas, of fear disguised as caution. And with each message, the same realization echoed through my mind. People do not need silence to survive, but systems of control do. Fear, after all, is the easiest way to shape a society without leaving fingerprints. You don't need walls when people build them inside themselves. You don't need guards when minds police their own thoughts. And that is what I had seen. An environment where even the suggestion of freedom created ripples strong enough to close borders. But here, back home, everything felt different. I could sit in my office, look out across the skyline of my own city, and speak without calculating every syllable. I could criticize, question, challenge, without worrying about whether a sentence would cost me my safety. And the more I appreciated that, the more I understood how rare it truly is. We often talk about freedom as if it's an abstract prize, something symbolic, something ceremonial. But freedom is not ceremonial. It is practical. It is fundamental. It is the quiet foundation beneath every bold decision, every new idea, every innovation that changes the world. Without it, everything shrinks. With it, everything expands. And in that moment, I felt deeply, almost painfully grateful for the place I called home. When I finally sat down to record this story, it wasn't out of frustration or to provoke controversy. It was simply to tell the truth, to show what happens when a single observation about the relationship between freedom and innovation becomes dangerous, to remind people that the ability to speak, to question, to even be wrong without fear is not normal everywhere. And if we don't appreciate it, we risk losing the very thing that makes progress possible. The ban cost me access, business, convenience. But it gave me something far more valuable: perspective. A renewed understanding of what it means to live in a place where the mind is allowed to stretch to its full height, where conversations can rise without restriction, where ideas don't require permission to exist. And so I say this without regret. If speaking a simple truth cost me entry into a country, then that truth was worth saying. If a sentence can close borders, then perhaps it revealed something that silence never could. I would rather be banned for honesty than welcomed for silence. Because in the end, the world does not move forward through quiet compliance. It moves through the courage to notice, to speak, to question, to stand firm even when the consequences arrive swiftly. And if my experience teaches anything, it is that freedom, true freedom, is not defined by the ability to travel anywhere. It is defined by the ability to speak everywhere. I remember sitting on that plane after everything had happened, after the interrogation, after the escort, after the quiet humiliation of being walked through an airport like a risk to national order. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a strange clarity. Not anger, not fear, clarity. The kind that comes when the world shows you something without filters, without polite fiction, without the sophisticated illusions that powerful nations and powerful people are so good at constructing. Sitting there, I realized something I hadn't fully appreciated before. When you grow up in a place where speaking freely is normal, where disagreement is ordinary, where criticism is a right rather than a danger, you start to forget how rare that is. You start to assume everyone lives that way, thinks that way, functions in that atmosphere of openness. But they don't. Most people in the world live inside invisible walls, some built by governments, some by culture, some by fear passed from parent to child. Walls so normal that people stop seeing them. And in that plane seat, looking out at a runway I would likely never see again, I understood that I had just walked, unintentionally, into someone else's wall. And walls don't move for visitors. The thing about power, real power, is that it doesn't announce itself with noise. It doesn't need to. It works quietly, through what people won't say, through what people are afraid to think, through the way conversations shrink, through the way eyes glance toward corners of rooms before opinions appear. The silence tells you more than speeches ever could. And over those days in that conference, I had watched silence in its purest form. Smart people lowering their voices, brilliant people avoiding topics, intelligent minds stepping carefully around simple truths like they were landmines. That experience stayed with me, even more than the ban. As the plane lifted, I thought about the entrepreneurs I had met, their talent, their ambition, their hunger to build something extraordinary, and I felt a kind of sadness for them. Because brilliance without freedom is like placing a rocket in a glass box. It has potential, energy, momentum, but it cannot take off. It cannot rise. It cannot become what it's meant to be. And the tragedy is that people inside that system often don't realize how limiting it is until they step outside of it, until they breathe different air, until they experience a place where their words don't echo back to them as warnings. I wish they could feel that. Not because one country's way is better or worse, but because everyone deserves the space to think, to question, to imagine without fear shaping the edges of their thoughts. When I landed back home, the contrast felt almost surreal. Airports bustling with arguments, jokes, complaints, all normal, all allowed, all human. Not monitored expressions of permitted emotion, but spontaneous, unfiltered slices of life. I walked through customs, and for the first time in my life, the simple question, anything to declare, felt symbolic. Because the truth was, yes, I did have something to declare. A lesson, a realization, a deeper understanding of how different the world can be depending on where you stand and what you're allowed to say. And as I stepped out into the cool air, I felt an emotion I didn't expect, gratitude. Not pride, not nationalism, just pure, uncomplicated gratitude for the invisible luxury I had always lived with, the luxury of words that didn't carry punishment. I thought about the ban a lot over the next days, not with bitterness, not with regret, but with a quiet acceptance. The ban wasn't a punishment, it was a message that truth, even gently spoken truth, still carries weight. Enough weight to shake someone, enough weight to be seen as a threat. And in a strange way, that validated everything I had said. Because if a simple, careful observation about freedom was enough to trigger that level of reaction, then it meant the truth was not only accurate, it was powerful. And power almost always tries to silence what threatens it. That's when something shifted in me. I realized that speaking the truth, your truth, observed truth, inconvenient truth, is never really about changing the world instantly. It's about refusing to let fear decide your vocabulary. It's about protecting that small piece of inner freedom that belongs to you and only you. And in losing access to one place, I gained a deeper clarity about my place in the world and the responsibility that comes with having a voice people listen to. The responsibility to use it, even when it costs you something. Especially when it costs you something. I didn't choose the ban, but I chose the moment that led to it. And looking back, I would still choose it. Because silence might keep doors open, but truth is what keeps your soul open. And I would rather lose access to a country than lose access to myself. If this story gave you something to think about, then stay with me. More truths, more depth, more perspective every single week. Hit subscribe and continue this journey with me.